This program is brought to you by the combined resources of the Wisconsin Historical Society and PBS Wisconsin.
On Wisconsin Hometown Stories, a river city in the heart of the state, built up by the harvest of the Great North Woods, transformed by immigrants, higher education, and the power of wonderful waters, where industry flourishes and nature is close at hand. On Wisconsin Hometown Stories, Stevens Point.
Funding for Wisconsin Hometown Stories, Stevens Point is provided by Century Insurance Foundation, Dr. Henry Anderson and Shirley Levine, Marshfield Clinic Health System, the Dick Cable Family, Mitzi and Bernie Holovic, Delta Dental of Wisconsin, Tina and Don Peters, JHL Digital Direct, the Ward and Ethel Cable Family Fund, Judy Cable Anderson, Dr. Henry Anderson, Community Foundation of Central Wisconsin, the Focus Fund for Wisconsin Programming, Friends of PBS Wisconsin, and education funding from the Timothy William Trout Education Fund.
The city of Stevens Point lies in the middle of two ecological regions. To the north, a towering pine forest. To the south, a hardwood forest mixed with prairie. In this area of overlap, called the tension zone, live an especially wide variety of plants and animals, which have drawn people to the area for thousands of years. An early map shows a network of well-worn Native American trails running through the tension zone, and the Stevens Point area became an early crossroads of activity.
The Menominee people were in the Stevens Point area historically. Was part of our ancestral territory, and we had a historic village site at Stevens Point. We called it Paskipalkanen. And what that means is the land that juts out into the waters. We made use of Stevens Point. It was just an area that was rich in resources. And it was here that our people harvested wild rice along the Wisconsin River, made maple sugar in maple groves, and fished and hunted, and was just a good area for us. The Wisconsin River was useful to not only the Menominees, but other tribes too, using the river as a historic highway, using it for transportation, for fishing, wild rice, trapping.
Trails also connected Native Americans to resources throughout the region. The trails through Stevens Point formed the groundwork for many of today's roads and highways.
Trail systems were kind of the equivalent to a water system. You know, if you couldn't travel by water, or if you needed to portage somewhere or get to a specific resource, you used the trail system. They might be a modern highway today, but they could go back thousands of years. People have been traversing that track for a very long time.
As Europeans began exploring the area, word spread of immense stands of white pine that would soon be cut along the Wisconsin River.
It's relatively light, so easy to transport. The cities needed volumes of the stuff to build, so it was just the perfect timing for the Great North Woods.
In 1836, the Treaty of the Cedars happened. The Menominee negotiated with the federal government, and then Governor Dodge of Wisconsin.
Chief Oshkosh was the head negotiator for our tribe. Although he didn't want to give up land, he thought he had to because he didn't want an army of soldiers coming upon our villages to bring harm to us. So he and other chiefs agreed to the Treaty of Cedars.
It would become known as the Lumberman's Treaty because it included a 6-mile wide strip of pine along the Wisconsin River. In the middle, on a point of land, with rapids just downstream to provide water power, was the future site of Stevens Point.
So it became the perfect place to store stuff because you were just around the rapids, and the river from here north for several miles was very calm, and you could use boats much more easily transported the stuff.
By the time the government hired Joshua Hathaway to survey the land for settlement, many of the water power sites in the area were already occupied.
He recorded the names given by early settlers of locations. The locals had told them that this point jutting out into the river was known as Stevens Point because he owned the cabin that was there. George Stevens was a lumberman from Elmond, New York. He heard about northern Wisconsin, so he made an expeditionary trip up in 1838 to see where these large lumber domains were.
Stevens used the point to store materials for a mill he was building at Big Bull Falls, the future site of Wausau. Despite his brief stay in the area, Stevens' connection to the point stuck.
Stevens Point is the gateway to the pineries. The Great Northern Pine Woods, they begin a little further north.
Towards the 1850s, 1860s, Stevens Point area became a good place to locate sawmills. The railroad hadn't come here yet, and the river was the means to transport all those logs.
They would cut the logs into rough-cut lumber and then organize them into these giant rafts that then could be floated downriver and then get it on down to, say, St. Louis, where it would be planed and made into fine lumber. And point became important because you had to stop here and hire what became known as a river pilot, people around here who knew the river. And they were probably the most highly paid men in the North Woods because their life expectancy was fairly short. And that's why the town began to grow, is because these loggers would stop here and have to wait until a river pilot was available.
Men poured into Stevens Point looking for jobs in the lumber mills and on the river. As it grew, the lumber town was able to incorporate as a city and officially took the name Stevens Point in 1858. The new city already featured 6 hotels, 10 saloons, and 3 schoolhouses. With a growing population, the city began to expand east of the river. And as people bought up land, the layout of the city took shape, including a key feature.
And Matthias Mitchell, who we really don't know anything about, came into the area and purchased a lot of this surveyed land and platted out a lot of what is now downtown Stevens Point. At some point, he then donates a fairly significant chunk of land to the city as a square, or what in Europe would have been the village green.
Matthias Mitchell's generous donation would live on as the public square would become the region's commercial center and a focal point of the city's history for generations to come. In 1976, the community of Stevens Point welcomed a Polish cardinal to their city.
This is my distinct privilege, pleasure, and honor to introduce to you His Eminence Karol Cardinal Wojtyla.
The visit of the future Pope John Paul II shone a spotlight on the rich Polish heritage of the Stevens Point area, a heritage that began in the 1800s with the arrival of Michael and Francis Kawakowski and their 9 children.
Well, Michael Kozakowski was a member of the minor nobility in Poland. He will come to the United States in 1857. He will be the first Polish settler in Stevens Point.
He spoke German well, so he could settle with the Germans and feel quite at home. He wrote letters home and convinced a number of his Polish neighbors to move to central Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, everything from one end to the other is like little Poland in the seasons, in the topography, and everything about it. What they left behind, they found in Wisconsin.
The opportunity to own land and to find jobs began a steady migration of families from what is now northwest Poland, with a large majority of people coming from the Kashubian region. Many Polish tradesmen found work in Stevens Point and settled on the north side. The city would eventually become home to the largest per capita population of Polish Americans in the country. At the turn of the 20th century, more than 1/3 of Portage County would be of Polish descent, creating the largest rural Polish population in the state. Most of the farmers that came weren't able to buy land back home and had to work for the local landowners. But in the Stevens Point area, they could pursue their dream of buying a farm of their own, even if it wasn't on the best land.
When the Poles came here, the Yankees or even the Germans and Irish had already purchased or got the best land.
The land was full of boulders and forested.
To be able to make it productive was a challenge. The whole family would work. They were all out in the fields.
When they came over here, they started with potatoes. Winter wheat was grown a lot. You had large vegetable gardens that they sold on the public square.
The market square was a place not only to gather and sell produce, but a social life. So the square was a very important part of life for the Polish people.
They come here for new opportunities. And at the same time, they want to maintain their heritage, they want to maintain their culture, and so they congregate around the only institution which they trust, the Roman Catholic Church.
With the church at the heart of their heritage and culture, Polish communities devoted their time, labor, and resources to constructing their own houses of worship. In 1871, Father Joseph Dombrowski moved his parish in Ellis away from the rowdy saloons there to a new site he called Polonia. Eventually taking the name Sacred Heart, it would grow to become the largest rural Catholic parish in Wisconsin.
Father Dombrowski also was very much involved in education. He got the Felician sisters to come over here, newly found order in Poland, in Krakow, and brought 5 nuns over here to teach the Polish children.
These are the sisters that taught the schools. They were very disciplined, very thorough in their teaching. If you went to a Polish school, you got an education.
In Stevens Point, a new order of Polish sisters began training nuns to teach in Catholic schools. The Sisters of St. Joseph of the Third Order of St. Francis would go on to serve throughout the country. The religious devotion of Polish farm families is also seen in the many shrines constructed throughout the countryside.
The roadside shrines is part of the Polish culture in Poland that was brought to the United States.
It was a way of connecting with their spiritual soul because the church was perhaps miles away they could not attend.
Craftsmanship and devotion is evident throughout the churches of the community. After a devastating fire destroyed St. Peter's Church, congregants came together to raise funds and rebuild. Local wood manufacturer John Buchholz donated supplies and tools for his workers to create an impressive high altar.
My pa helped build the altars. Lullaby let them use all the tools. They spent many hours there. And when I went to work in Milwaukee, and I said I lived in Stevens Point, the people that were talking to me said, "Oh, Have you ever been in that beautiful cathedral on Highway 51? It was very beautiful.
Polish heritage is also conveyed through music, and in Stevens Point, that means polka.
Polka was big. It's always big. It's always going to be big. Everybody polkaed.
I met my husband at a polka dance. Everybody I know, they met their spouses at a polka dance.
When they play the polka from Stevens Point.
It's amazing to me that the polkas are still so popular. And some of the same old ones we played years ago are still being played.
It was just fun to watch them dance. The daddies and mamas with the little kids dancing, and the kids would be flying around sometime. And you know that those kids were going to be dancing to the polka forever.
I'm Polish and proud. I love our tradition. I hope it never dies.
I guess everybody polka!
With its lumber industries on the Wisconsin River, Stevens Point became a bustling boom town. And as early lumberjacks, river rafters, and sawmill workers would soon find out, it was also a perfect place to brew beer. In the mid-1850s, a brewery built on the outskirts of town would go on to become one of the oldest breweries in the country.
The brewery had different ownership throughout the years, and it wasn't until like the 1880s with Andrew Lutz that he started branding his barrels with Stevens Point Brewery, and the name just kind of stuck then.
The namesake brewery grew along with the city, although it faced competition. In the early 1900s, the Polish Brewing Company arrived in town.
But in 1908, there was this huge cyclone that ripped through Stevens Point right along the river and totally decimated the Polish Brewing Company. They did rebuild, but then in about 1916, they had a spoiled batch of beer, and Prohibition was already kind of seen on the horizon, and they decided to not reinvest in opening the brewery again. So 1917 was the last time that Point had an in-town competitor.
Point Brewery outlasted the competition with a focus on only serving the local community. A growing Stevens Point led to a thriving Point Brewery.
Now, that all seems to be going great until Prohibition hits.
And that really put a strain on the brewery. It was difficult for them to continue operating, but they did. They never shut down.
Prohibition hit breweries hard across the nation, and Point Brewery was no exception. Survival meant ingenuity. Breweries turned to soda products or near beer, a non-alcoholic beer, to keep them afloat.
And in 1927-28, the Stevens Point Brewing Company came up with a new near beer, and they decided to call it Point Special Beverage.
It was basically taking Point Special and boiling all the alcohol out of it, so it was a non-alcohol beer.
After Prohibition, all they did to the label was change the word beverage to beer. Throughout brewing history, breweries mainly focused on 1 or 2 beers a year. Point Special was the flagship beer since Prohibition.
So we've dabbled in different things over the years, but it's still, you know, when you think of Stevens Point Brewery, you're thinking of Point Special.
With the challenge of Prohibition behind them, Point Brewery faced a new threat: fierce competition from bigger brewers. Wisconsin was once home to 350 breweries. By 1973, only 9 remained, with Stevens Point the smallest and the most vulnerable.
The competition was really getting tough, and the biggest one is price. A Miller or Budweiser could certainly underprice us, and they did. It's a good deal for the bar owner, but it's bad for the Stevens Point Brewery because that's our competition. And that was really, really tough.
But in 1973, a big boost.
There was an article by a writer in Chicago. His name is Mike Royko. He wrote an article basically saying that most American beers tasted like they went through a horse. So what he did was he had a blind taste test. And somehow Point Beer got over to him, and we came out the #1 beer in the United States, second beer in the world. Well, that was phenomenal for the brewery. I truly believe that kept the brewery going. And there was instant 20% increase in sales.
They got requests for beer from TWA Airlines, as well as distributors all over, and they knew that they would not be able to keep up with the orders and the capacity that these places needed to be able to have Point Beer. So they said, no, if you want this beer, you have to come to Stevens Point. It was always really important that Point Brewery could supply the people of Stevens Point and central Wisconsin with their beer.
The newfound fame of Point Special brought attention to an important factor that contributed to its quality.
Stevens Point is known for many things. One of them is the water quality there. The tap water is some of the best in the country.
The quality ingredients that go into making beer are hops, water, yeast, and grain. Every one is very important. We do an ultrafiltration on it, but we use the water as it comes from the city. The water here at the brewery is perfect. It's part of that original formula.
It's the beer that's light and clear.
You ask any of the people in the surrounding area if they remember the Point jingle, and they'll all sing it to you.
Tastes so good, satisfies completely like good beer should.
I mean, I heard that jingle all my growing up years.
Point Special beer.
How many cities can say that they have a beer that's actually part of the city's name? The brewery really is integral to this city and integral to the community.
Special beer.
Brewed in the city of wonderful water.
Won't you make it a point to buy Point?
This is our town, Stevens Point, Wisconsin, USA. It's a community where industry flourishes with the help of skilled workers, direct transportation, cooperative utilities, and remarkably pure, abundant water. Stevens Point is the industrial, commercial, and educational center of Portage County.
There was a lot of industry, rail industry in this area. Where our house was, we had right behind us, we had Jern's Furniture Company. And to our south, we had Vedder's Manufacturing, and right next door on the north, we had Bakerade Baking, so we could actually take fresh donuts right off of the line. About a block and a half away was Consolidated Papers. You could walk through there, and it was kind of fun as a kid to go watch how the paper was being made. And so there was all lots and lots, hundreds if not thousands of jobs for factories.
By the mid-20th century, growing industries and a new identity as a college town reflected the huge changes made in Stevens Point as the lumber boom came to an end.
The lumber boom began to fade in the 1880s, 1890s. By 1910, it's pretty much done. There was 600 billion board feet of timber across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The loggers actually thought that if they started in Michigan, by the time they got through Minnesota, years and years later, the woods would have grown back again. These guys were so efficient that it took them only about 40 years to cut all the way through it.
The driving force behind taking the city from being a rough lumber town to an economically diverse community started with one event.
The Wisconsin Central Railroad came to Stevens Point.
So you had the perfect situation for Stevens Point. You have the lumber here, why not ship it on the rails? And as long as you have the lumber here, why not develop furniture factories? So you have several major furniture factories beginning to develop in Stevens Point.
The developing industry of furniture and wood manufacturing included the Automatic Cradle Company. It would grow to become the largest manufacturer in the city, eventually taking the name Lullaby Furniture.
The well-being of young people is reflected in a Lullaby Furniture Corporation, which made Stevens Point the cradle of the juvenile furniture industry.
Lullaby got its start when founder John Buchholz invented a unique cradle,
which was a self-rocking cradle based on a huge spring, and you'd crank the spring up, and then the cradle would rock side to side with a click in it, which was very comforting to the baby, and becomes a nationally known business.
It became kind of a Cadillac of baby furniture. They were sponsors of the I Love Lucy program around the time that Lucy was having her baby. They had a complete line of I Love Lucy furniture.
The railroad allowed wood manufacturers access to a national market, and the city's location in the state made it an ideal central hub for railroad lines.
A big boost came when Soo Line decided to put an area headquarters here. It provided many jobs to local people, so this was a booming railroad town also.
The Wisconsin River that once powered sawmills and floated lumber rafts would now power new industries.
Whiting Clover Paper Company, manufacturers of high-grade all-rag and rag content business papers and specialties. This is paper before it's formed into sheets. The paper is re-wet, starched and dried in warm air, giving it the ripple finish characteristic of fine rag bond paper.
The hard-working Wisconsin River provided the hydroelectric power and water needed to support the new paper industry. 3 dams were built to control the river, 2 from Consolidated Paper and 1 from Whiting Clover Paper Mill.
They needed reservoirs so that they had a constant flow of the river. As a result, they hid a lot of historical landmarks, and one of those was Stevens Point, which was basically washed away because the river was higher.
Downtown Stevens Point was growing and thriving, too, with the arrival of new businesses.
Stevens Point makes a sizable contribution to the world of books in products of the Warzella Publishing Company. Finished books are shipped to points all over the country. Sturdy, attractive books from Warzella's are good representatives of Stevens Point workmanship.
Warzella actually starts out as a printer of a Polish language newspaper, which they purchased, called Rolnik, meaning farmer. And then about 1908, they start a second newspaper called Gwiazda Polarna, Northern Star.
This paper would go on to become America's oldest independent Polish language newspaper. Warzella later expanded into book printing and binding, adding to their national reputation. In addition to book publishing, another Stevens Point business expanded nationally by providing specialty insurance at a lower cost. To fight high insurance rates, hardware store owner P.J. Jacobs teamed up with other Wisconsin store owners to form the Hardware Dealers Mutual Fire Insurance Company in 1904. Elected as the company director in 1912, P.J. moved the headquarters to Stevens Point. The Hardware Mutual Insurance Building was constructed downtown in 1922. Under P.J.'s direction, the company grew quickly, and in 1929, an addition was built, tripling the size of the building.
Carl, his son, finally does take over the business from his father. He is the guy that really begins to expand it and becomes very well known in the community.
Hardware Mutual would expand its insurance services through the years and remain as one of the city's major employers, eventually changing its name to Century Insurance. As diverse businesses grew in Stevens Point, local leaders launched a campaign to make the city a center for education.
60 years ago, a group of Stevens Pointers raised $50,000 to make sure the new state college would be built here.
As more immigrants continued to settle in Wisconsin, The Wisconsin Board of Regents established what were referred to as normal schools to train teachers for the growing population. In 1893, there were 5 of these schools, and the board was deciding where to locate the next one.
There were 20 other cities competing for it. The main one was Wausau, and the Board of Regents picked Point. It didn't make Wausau very happy, as you can imagine. When the Board of Regents announced that Stevens Point was going to get the university, a guy by the name of G.E. McDill, who was in Madison at the time representing Stevens Point, announced to the city, "Boys, the world is ours."
Bells, whistles, and cheers rang out in Stevens Point at the news of being awarded the normal school. The school would evolve from being a teacher's college to becoming part of the University of Wisconsin system and a key driver of the Stevens Point community.
Stevens Point, where people enjoy living and can work together, whether simply to have fun or to build a better community and a better future. That's our town, a wonderful town, Stevens Point, Wisconsin, USA.
I remember going fishing with my dad on the Tomorrow River, which is one of the premier fishing streams in the area. Fly fishing in central Wisconsin is wonderful.
The same waters that were around 100 years ago are around today.
What I look for in a good fly fishing area is good, clean, cold water, especially when you're fishing for trout. Now, you know, Wisconsin is one of the perfect places for it.
The abundance of cold water streams makes Stevens Point a perfect destination for fly fishing. In the early 20th century, it was also renowned for the quality fishing flies being made there. It all started when school teacher Carrie Frost took a job in Stevens Point to move closer to family, especially her father, with whom she shared a special bond.
Her father, John Clark, was also an avid hunter and fisherman, and he taught her to fly fish early in her life.
But it was not common in those days for women to fish, especially young girls. And so it's interesting that Carrie Frost's dad took her fishing.
Carrie was an expert fly fisherwoman. Some say that Carrie could lay a fly in a calm pond without causing a ripple.
The flies that were around in the late 1800s all came from Great Britain or from Europe. The problem with them was that they were not on time. When they finally showed up, they were sloppily made.
In May of 1896, after missing a shipment of flies, her father asked her to tie some flies for the coming fishing season.
The locals saw that Carrie and her dad caught the most fish. They went over and said, "What are you catching those fish on?" And so Carrie started out by tying flies on a small scale for the people in her neighborhood.
Well, she started tying flies that matched more the insects in this area. So she essentially filled a niche.
The fly tying business became so busy that she left teaching in order to start the fly tying business.
Carrie formed the C.J. Frost Fishing Tackle Manufacturing Company in 1896. The business began operations out of the family home, but soon more space and more workers were needed.
In 5 years, she had expanded the number of employees to 45. 10 years after starting, she's now employing nearly 100 women. And in that year, she had a new brick building built, C.J. Frost, across the top.
Now, for the first time, Americans were able to travel inexpensively across their own country in their own cars and see the grandeur of their...
As more people could afford to own automobiles and had more leisure time to hit the road, Carrie's company supplied the needs of a growing fishing industry.
A typical employee could tie one gross a day, 144 flies per day. So when you add up all those numbers, you come up with about 4.5 million pieces per year put out by the company at its peak.
Carrie's business was actually the first of its kind in the United States. No one had thought to tie flies on a commercial level. She broke so many barriers at that time.
As the company grew, Carrie's father John and brother George came to work for her, becoming the few men working at the company.
Carrie's employees were women at the time for a couple of key reasons. One was she offered a very kind of unique opportunity for ladies at the time to stay local and earn a pretty decent salary. They were actually recruiting the young gals right out of high school to participate in fly tying. I think she also, as a feminist at the time, wanted to encourage opportunities for ladies. But in addition to that, the ladies were great fly tyers.
Carrie's flies were mostly sold in hardware stores and would be branded with the store's name. Unlike her competitors, she would also put her company's name on these products as the manufacturer, often including Miss before the name of her company.
I believe that Carrie was selective in when she chose to point out that she was a female. I think she was at times had to maybe be cautious for business reasons to leave the Miss off. But when she wanted to put the pedal to the metal and make it clear that, hey, I'm a female and I'm running this outfit, she was not afraid to use the term Miss.
And her name started to carry so much weight. She would put her name on the flies because that was a way to show people that, yes, women can put out quality products in the fly fishing world, and we can make a superior product.
In 1920, at the height of the company's size and production, Carrie sold her business. At that time, the company had around 150 employees and was the largest producer of flies in the country. Carrie's company was only the beginning of what would become a fly tying empire in Stevens Point. Her brother George would even start his own company, G.W. Frost & Sons. The strength of the family name was reflected in his company's slogan, "Fish Fight for Frost Flies."
Stevens Point was home to many fly tying companies. C.J. Frost, subsequently the Frost Fishing Tackle Company, Weber Lifelike Fly, G.W. Frost & Sons, and even smaller organizations like A.J. Koshalik, William Plantico and Sons. Joe Worth originated the Worth Company in 1940 in Stevens Point. Worth was also tying flies at the time, so Stevens Point has a rich history of fly tying and fly tying companies.
With so many fly tying companies in one city, there was competition for the best tyers. Businesses would install air conditioners, upgrade their bathrooms, and provide other amenities to keep the best fly tyers.
The fly tying in Stevens Point is said to have had its peak in the early 1940s. It's thought that there were 500 to 600 fly tyers in the area, tying some 10 million flies annually, so a really remarkable number.
So the Stevens Point area was the perfect place for Carrie Frost to start her business because fly fishing was very prominent in that area. And so having the business right there was just a natural place. Stevens Point is known as the fly tying capital of the world, and it's all because of what Carrie had done. She's the one who put it on the map.
Stevens Point lies in the Central Sands region of Wisconsin, a landscape made up of sand, gravel, and boulders.
We're a very glaciated area here. The glaciers have defined what our topography looks like. When the glaciers melted, they left behind a very important water resource and a very important soil resource.
They ground up northern Wisconsin and Canada into sand, and we're sitting on what was the rummage sale of the north end of the continent.
The rocky, sandy soils in the area were low in fertility, but immigrant farmers brought a tradition of growing one crop that did well in sand, potatoes.
Stevens Point's the urban focus of Wisconsin's potato industry. When the railroads came in and they get loaded on the car and go to Chicago or wherever, suddenly you had the world at your door.
Everyone was a potato farmer. They raised potatoes as a main crop. Schools had a potato vacation when it was harvesting time, and you got 2 weeks off when we were all supposed to help your mother and dad with harvesting the potatoes. Every day we had potatoes fried, baked, cooked. It's the way, every way. I don't think there ever was a dinner made without potatoes.
To celebrate the success of potato farming, Stevens Point had their first potato festival in 1936. The prize-winning bushel of potatoes was sent to President Franklin Roosevelt, and a potato queen was crowned. The humble potato had gone from farm-table staple to a source of community pride. In good years, farmers on the Central Sands grew enough food to feed their families and sell the surplus. But periods of drought created hard times, as the sandy soils quickly dried up and potato yields went down. After World War II, farmers began to take advantage of a new lightweight aluminum piping to irrigate their crops.
The whole operation is quite simple. The sprinkler line distributes water for about 2 hours or more, then it's disconnected, carried over to the next location, and reassembled. It just couldn't be much simpler.
We started to irrigate potatoes in the early 40s out of a stream about a quarter of a mile away from here, and at that time we thought the yield increase was dramatic. In other words, we got up to 250, 300 bushels per acre, which was double what we were used to getting.
Early irrigation was basically out of ponds, or specifically they were called pits. They were dug with steam shovels and large backhoes.
Portable irrigation transformed the farms of the Central Sands area, which now joined the agricultural revolution sweeping across the country. The UW-Madison Hancock Research Station, located south of Stevens Point, helped farmers apply the latest research and technologies.
Their mission is to serve the local farmers in the kind of farming that they do and help them figure out how to address problems. They keep farmers up to speed on what's the latest and greatest with potato and vegetable production. They basically extend their research to the local community.
The Hancock Field Days are almost as good as farm auctions and funeral suppers. We have a chance just to get together. Then the researchers present what they've been doing, and they cue us into what's going on.
With help from the Hancock Research Center, the farms of the Central Sands flourished.
It really was a bit like discovering gold when we realized sometime in the late 40s and 50s that down there was a big body of water, the aquifer.
In the late 1950s, growers used a new drilling technique to put in wells capable of pumping up much larger volumes of water for a new type of irrigation.
Perhaps the biggest evolution was the invention of the center pivot, and it has defined our part of the state.
It's basically a set of pipes whose center point is in the middle of a circle that goes around in a circle and waters your crop.
Irrigation brought stability. It largely impacts the vegetables, and that's potatoes, it's green beans, it's peas, it's carrots, cabbage, and it would transform the value of the field and its production 2 or 3 times. About the same time, commercial fertilizer became possible. The yields, again, from 40 hundredweights to 100, 150, add the water, just remarkable.
Like everything in life, there are pros and cons. And the great thing about Central Sands agriculture is that we grow wonderful crops, and these crops contribute to the Stevens Point economy. Along the way, we have learned when you apply fertilizer and chemicals to sandy soil, that some of those excess chemicals can end up in the groundwater. In the 1980s, we had a professor here at Stevens Point. His name was Byron Shaw. His students discovered a pesticide in groundwater that was a byproduct of potato production in the Central Sands. And so then the problem had to be addressed. Well, it's 30 years later, and we've figured out ways to grow potatoes without this particular chemical.
It's all a developing science. There's new ways to deliver the product that may be easier, simpler, cost-effective, maybe even more ethical.
With irrigation, university research, and generations of hard work, Central Sands farmers made Wisconsin into the largest producer of potatoes east of the Mississippi, and one of the largest vegetable producers in the country.
We still have that love affair with the potato.
The majestic white pine trees, which brought the lumbermen to Stevens Point, still tower above the city's many parks and green spaces. To encourage the use and enjoyment of these treasured places, a group of civic-minded residents pursued a new idea in 1989.
The trail was a relatively new idea in its day. The idea was to take the wonderful parks we have in Stevens Point and to connect them so that folks could walk, bike, take their dogs, push their strollers over the entire greater Stevens Point Plover Whiting area.
The Green Circle Trail would string together the jewels of the city's park system, a system that began when people complained about the quality of the drinking water drawn from the Wisconsin River.
And the water tended to be murky, not necessarily bad health-wise, but it was not pleasant. It kind of smelled. Then the city discovered the aquifer to the east of the city and began to pump that water and just kind of took on the name, the City of Wonderful Water, because of the clarity.
To protect the underground aquifer, the city purchased the land around the wells, including a section of the Plover River with a popular swimming hole. This ready-made recreation area soon became a city park. In 1935, a generous gift more than doubled the size of the park.
Jules Iverson, a local businessman in town, purchased it with the idea that it was for the children of Portage County. That park today bears his name.
As Iverson Park grew on the city's east side, changes to the west side were occurring along the Wisconsin riverfront.
There were lumber mills all along the river. Once those began to disappear, then the idea began to develop of, maybe this would be good parkland.
So that water crisis that created Iverson Park also created Buchholz Park, because the old water plant in what became Buchholz Park was abandoned. So it was excellent land right on the Wisconsin River. It was just a natural to become a park.
Improvements to the swimming beaches of both parks proved to be highly popular with the children of Stevens Point.
Swimming was pretty important back in the day. They didn't have air conditioning.
We had a lot of fun there. We just wanted to swim. You could go up on the dock, and there was a 15-foot scaffold where the brave people dived off, not me. I climbed up, but I climbed off, too.
The Green Circle Trail provides a journey through history, passing by a collection of park buildings built during the Great Depression. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, employed local people and used local materials for the construction.
They used local sandstone to create some of those beautiful buildings that are still in use today in those parks. Gives them a very timeless look.
Through the years, more recreational opportunities were added at Iverson Park, including a ski jump and toboggan slides. The anchor point of the Green Circle Trail is the Schmeeckley Reserve, a 280-acre conservancy on the UW-Stevens Point campus named for Fred Schmeeckley, a professor who came to teach in 1923.
Fred Schmeeckley was hired to teach agriculture and science. He decided that conservation was a really important thing and that teachers also needed to know about that.
Soil erosion, destruction of forests, pollution of water, and misuse of wildlife were factors that started me thinking that something should be done to educate people in the wise use of resources.
He started teaching a few conservation courses, and in 1946, it became the first conservation education major in the United States. He's called the father of conservation here at Stevens Point. And he really was ahead of his time. He was really a pioneer.
The late 1960s is really the start of the environmental movement. And natural resources in general has always been very popular in Wisconsin. This was sort of a natural place in a natural time. In the 1970s, the conservation major became the College of Natural Resources. And so this grew into the largest natural resources-based undergraduate program in the country.
You can find majors not only in the United States, but all over the world.
One thing that sets our students apart is the hands-on nature of our program, and that really started with Fred Schmeeckley. He was a hands-on guy, and the university had a parcel of land just to the north of campus that they purchased with the idea of potentially expanding there. But Schmeeckley used it as an outdoor classroom.
The land used by Schmeeckley would officially become a conservancy in 1977 and named in his honor. Today, the university continues to use the land as an outdoor laboratory and training ground for natural restoration.
It also is a community resource. It's a quiet, wonderful place to come, and the community takes advantage of that.
Today, people look at the reserve as a place to get back to a more natural rhythm.
This is also the trailhead for the 27-mile Green Circle Trail.
The trail was an inherent problem to create because they didn't have natural public lands that connected all of these neat parks and all these points of interest. And they needed to win over private landowners because they had no money to rent land or anything. And many, many people signed off. So you get these corridors of green to connect the whole area. There's been a lot of unity, a lot of cooperation.
Community-minded people who got together and found ways to make the world a better place.
The city's dedication to improving their community is evident in the sculpture garden located along the Green Circle Trail. Created in 2009, the 20-acre park features the work of local and national artists in a setting that connects nature and art. The city's commitment to the arts is also seen in the murals in the downtown area. Many depict the city's history and important residents. The Stevens Point Square continues to serve as an anchor for the community, providing a place to gather and find refreshment on warm summer days. The farmers market still draws crowds in search of local produce. As legacy businesses thrive and grow, Stevens Point welcomes new industries, creating a diverse local economy poised for future growth.
Stevens Point is culturally and ecologically the center of the state. I mean, this has been a mecca for people to come to for the last 12,000 years. And I think that just speaks well to our shared history in the state and what an amazing place this is.
To purchase a DVD of Wisconsin Hometown Stories, Stevens Point, call 1-800-422-9707 or visit the PBS Wisconsin online store at the address on the screen.
Funding for Wisconsin Hometown Stories, Stevens Point is provided by Century Insurance Foundation, Dr. Henry Anderson and Shirley Levine, Marshfield Clinic Health System, the Dick Cable Family, Mitzi and Bernie Holovic, Delta Dental of Wisconsin, Tina and Don Peters, JHL Digital Direct, the Ward and Ethel Cable Family Fund, Judy Cable Anderson, Dr. Henry Anderson, Community Foundation of Central Wisconsin, the Focus Fund for Wisconsin Programming, Friends of PBS Wisconsin, and education funding from the Timothy William Trout Education Fund.